"Don't fall in love with me," the sheriff warned. He said it without looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the two men squared off in the middle of Redstone Creek's main street, hands hovering over their holsters like they were deciding whether today was a good day to make a widow somewhere. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that came not from the absence of danger, but from a man who had stood inside it so many times that it had become familiar, like an old neighbor he no longer bothered to greet. Silla Vane stood exactly where the stagecoach had deposited her, in the middle of everything, naturally, clutching her carpet bag against her chest, her ivory travel coat already acquiring a fine layer of Arizona dust, her hat tilted at an angle that suggested the wind had opinions about Boston fashion. She had stepped off the coach expecting a quiet frontier town. She had instead stepped into what appeared to be a very public argument with guns involved. "I beg your pardon," she managed. "You're standing in my line of sight, ma'am," the sheriff said, still without looking at her. "Step left, and I wasn't talking to you specifically, just anyone in the general vicinity who might get any ideas." Silla stepped left. She did not get any ideas. She told herself this firmly. The sheriff, tall, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that gave this town its name, stepped forward into the middle of the street with the unhurried ease of a man taking a Sunday stroll. His badge caught the high desert sun. His boots raised small clouds of dust with every step. "All right, gentlemen," he said, and the word gentleman carried just enough dry amusement to make both armed men blink. "Whatever this is about, I promise you it isn't worth the paperwork." One of the men, red-faced, sweating through his shirt, jabbed a finger at the other. "He cheated me at cards, Sheriff Madigan. I saw it with my own eyes." Sheriff Madigan tilted his head at the accused, a wiry fellow who had the guilty look of someone who absolutely had cheated at cards. "That true?" The wiry man opened his mouth, closed it. "I'll take that as a complicated yes," the sheriff said pleasantly. He looked between them with the patience of a schoolteacher managing two particularly unreasonable children. "Here's what's going to happen. You," he pointed at the card cheat, "are going to return whatever you won in the last 3 hands. And you," he pointed at the red-faced man, "are going to go have a glass of water because you look like you're about to have a very dramatic afternoon. We're all going to do this without shooting anyone, because it is a Tuesday, and I have had a perfectly acceptable Tuesday so far, and I'd like to keep it that way." There was a long moment. A tumbleweed, apparently feeling the theatrical pressure, rolled slowly past. The wiry man reached into his vest and pulled out a folded collection of bills. He held them out. The red-faced man snatched them. Both holsters stayed closed. The small crowd that had gathered on the wooden sidewalks exhaled collectively and dispersed as though nothing had happened. Sheriff Madigan turned and walked back toward the sheriff's office, pausing only when he nearly walked directly into Silla, who had not moved a second time because she had forgotten to. He looked at her then, properly. She looked back. He had dark eyes, the kind that gave very little away, and a face that was handsome in a weathered, completely unself-conscious way, as though he'd never once considered it. There was a small scar along his chin and dust on his hat and something quietly steady about him that Silla found immediately and unreasonably irritating, the way composure in other people often irritates those who are currently not composed. "You're the Boston woman," he said. It wasn't a question. In a town of 400 people, apparently a woman in an ivory travel coat with tilted hat was not difficult to identify. "Silla Vane," she said, drawing herself up. "I've come to claim my Uncle Gerald's ranch. He passed 2 months ago and left it to me in his will." Something moved briefly behind the sheriff's eyes. "I know about Gerald. Good man." He touched the brim of his hat. "Sheriff Colt Madigan. And I hate to be the first piece of bad news you receive in Redstone Creek, Miss Vane, but there are currently 3 squatters occupying your uncle's property who don't seem to have received the legal correspondence informing them it's no longer available." Silla stared at him, then removed them. "Working on it," he said, without any particular urgency that she appreciated. "Due process takes a day or 2. In the meantime, we can arrange." "I don't need arranging," Silla said. "I need my ranch." Sheriff Madigan regarded her with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations for the afternoon. "I understand that, and you'll have it, but tonight, Mrs. Hattie at the bakehouse has a room she lets. I'll walk you over. I don't need an escort either. The last stagecoach passenger who said that to me ended up turned around in the wrong direction for 40 minutes, he said, already walking. Town's not big, but it's confusing if you don't know it." Silla picked up her carpet bag, straightened her tilted hat with considerable dignity, and followed him. She told herself it was purely practical. They walked in silence for half a block before she said, without particularly meaning to, "That was well handled, back there." He glanced sideways at her. "It was a Tuesday," he said simply, and then, because she couldn't entirely help it, Silla smiled. She looked away before he could see it, or so she believed. Sheriff Colt Madigan said nothing, but as they walked, the very corner of his mouth did something that on a less guarded face would have been called a smile. She looked back once as she followed Mrs. Hattie inside. He was already watching. 3 days passed before Silla's ranch was legally hers again. She knew this because she counted every one of them, measured in the particular frustration of a woman, accustomed to problems that money and a good Boston solicitor could solve promptly, now discovering that the Arizona Territory operated on an entirely different relationship with the word promptly. Sheriff Madigan filed the documents. He spoke with the territorial judge. He handled it all with the same unhurried competence that she was beginning to find either deeply reassuring or deeply maddening, depending on the hour. On the morning of the 4th day, he appeared at Mrs. Hattie's door with his hat in his hand and told her the ranch was clear. "I'll take you out myself," he said. "That isn't necessary," she said. "No," he agreed, "but the East Trail has a washout from last week's rain that isn't marked, and I'd rather not spend my afternoon pulling a Boston woman and her luggage out of a ditch." Silla picked up her bags. He took them from her without asking, which she prepared to object to, and then found she didn't, which bothered her more than the gesture itself. The ride out was quiet in the way that long, comfortable silences sometimes are, the kind neither person wants to be the first to fill. The desert morning was extraordinary, all copper light and wide sky, and Silla, who had prepared herself to dislike everything about this territory, found the landscape almost aggressively beautiful. She said nothing about this. She suspected Colt already knew. Her uncle's ranch was modest, a sturdy timber house, a barn that needed attention, a water well, and a stretch of grazing land that rolled out toward a line of red bluffs in the distance. It smelled like dry earth and cedar, and something she had no city word for. Standing in front of it, Silla felt unexpectedly that her uncle had loved this place. The realization arrived quietly and lodged itself somewhere behind her sternum. "It needs work," Colt said beside her. "I'm not afraid of work," she replied. He looked at her sideways. She could tell he was deciding whether or not he believed her. She resolved to make him believe her. What followed was the most instructive and humbling week of Silla Vane's 27 years. She learned that collecting eggs from a hen who had strong opinions about the matter was, in fact, a confrontation. She learned that a fence post did not simply go into the ground through the power of intention alone. She learned that a wood stove required a relationship, a specific, patient, negotiated relationship, before it would cooperate in the morning. She learned most of these things by failing at them first. Colt had a habit of appearing when things had gone sideways, not immediately, and never in a way that suggested he had been watching, but with the suspiciously good timing of a man who happened to have taken the long route past a particular stretch of fence, or happened to be riding by when a stove had produced more smoke than heat. He would fix the problem efficiently, explain what had gone wrong in plain language with no condescension in it, and then find somewhere else to be before she had to figure out how to thank him. It was, she decided, one of the kindest things she had ever witnessed, the not making her feel small about it. The town's midsummer festival arrived at the end of her second week, a sprawling, cheerful affair that took over the main street with fiddle music and paper lanterns, and the smell of roasted corn and fresh pie. Silla attended because Mrs. Hattie insisted, and because she had begun to understand that in Redstone Creek, community events were not optional so much as they were oxygen. She was doing fine, speaking with the blacksmith's wife, admiring the children's foot race, when the fiddles struck up a dancing reel, and partners materialized from every direction with the efficiency of people who had done this many times. Silla found herself standing alone beside a water barrel in the particular way that makes a person feel both invisible and extremely visible simultaneously. "You look like someone who was never taught to ask for help," said a voice beside her. She turned. Colt stood there, hat in hand again. She noticed he always removed his hat when he spoke to her directly, as though the conversation deserved that, looking at her with those dark eyes that gave so little away and yet somehow lately gave just enough. "I don't need," she began. "I know," he said. He held out his hand anyway. She took it. She told herself it was to avoid further social awkwardness. They danced. The reel was fast and the crowd was lively, and there was nothing inherently significant about two people turning through the steps of a common frontier dance. Silla told herself this through the first pass. By the second, the fiddles slowed unexpectedly into something quieter, and neither of them stepped apart the way the change in tempo suggested they might. His hand was warm at her waist. She was looking at the lanterns, and then she wasn't. The song ended. They separated by appropriate inches. "You dance well," she said, which was the safest available sentence. "My wife taught me," he said simply. The word wife arrived gently but fully, and Silla absorbed it without letting her expression change. Mrs. Hattie told her the rest later that evening, over chamomile tea and the particular kindness of an older woman who understood things. 3 years ago. A fever that moved too fast. Colt had buried her in the spring and kept the town running all summer because somebody had to, and he was the kind of man who did what needed doing regardless of what it cost him. Silla understood his warning now in a way she hadn't on that first dusty Tuesday. She sat down that night to write her letter home to Boston. "I'll return within the month," she wrote. "The ranch is manageable and the territory is not entirely without its merits." She folded it, set it on the table. She did not walk to the post office the next morning. She told herself there was no particular reason for this. The traveling photographer who had set up near the festival stage delivered his prints to the general store 3 days later. Mrs. Hattie purchased one without Silla's knowledge and left it on her kitchen table with no note. It was a photograph of the festival, the lanterns, the crowd, the wide summer night. And there at the left edge of the frame stood Silla and Colt, side by side, not dancing, not speaking, just existing in the same space, closer than either of them remembered standing. The Duskriders arrived in Redstone Creek the way bad news always does, quietly at first, and then all at once. They numbered 7, led by a man named Harlan Voss, who had the particular distinction of being both charming at a distance and dangerous up close. They rode through town on a Wednesday morning, bought whiskey at the saloon, smiled at the right people, and left without incident. Colt watched them from the doorway of his office with the stillness of a man who had learned that trouble rarely announced itself loudly on the first visit. He sent a telegraph to the territorial marshal's office before noon. The second visit was different. Word spread through Redstone Creek by Thursday evening that the Duskriders had approached 3 ranchers on the southern edge of town, offering to purchase their land at prices so low they were effectively a threat, wearing the costume of a business proposition. 2 ranchers had quietly agreed, frightened enough by Voss's pleasant smile and the 7 horses behind him to sign whatever was put in front of them. The third had refused. His barn burned to the ground by Friday morning. Nobody could prove anything. Nobody was surprised. Silla's ranch sat squarely on the southern edge of town. Colt rode out to her property that Friday afternoon. He told himself it was a routine check. He had been telling himself variations of this same story for 2 weeks now, and was beginning to find it unconvincing. He found her on the roof of the barn, replacing damaged shingles with a focus and physical determination that had long since ceased to surprise him. She had shed the ivory travel coat permanently by now. She wore a practical cotton shirt and her hair pulled back and there was sawdust on her cheek, and she looked more at home on that rooftop than she probably realized. "You should come down," he called up. "I'm almost finished," she called back. "There's something I need to tell you." Something in his tone carried. She came down. He told her about the Duskriders plainly and without softening it, because she was not a woman who appreciated information softened, and he had learned this about her the way he had learned most things about her, by paying attention when he was supposed to be doing something else. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "They'll come here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Likely," he said. "Then we'll be ready," she said. He noticed she said "we" without hesitating. He noticed it more than was strictly professional. He began spending evenings at the ranch. He told the town it was a protective measure during an active threat investigation, which was entirely true and also not the complete truth. He sat on her porch in the cooling desert evenings and they talked about the ranch, about the town, about things further afield. She told him about Boston, about a life that had been comfortable and correct and quietly suffocating. He told her about Redstone Creek, about the years he had spent turning a rough mining settlement into something resembling a community. He did not talk about his wife directly. He didn't need to. The shape of that absence existed in the pauses between his words, and Silla, who was learning to read him the way you learn a landscape, slowly, carefully, with great attention to what lies beneath the surface, understood it without requiring it spoken. The Duskriders came on a moonless Tuesday. Silla heard the horses first, 4 of them, coming up the east trail without lanterns, which told her everything about their intentions. She had her uncle's rifle in her hands before she reached the front door. Colt was already on the porch, having heard them 30 seconds before she did. He held up one hand, wait, and stepped down into the yard. Harlan Voss pulled his horse to a stop at the fence line. In the darkness, he was a silhouette with a pleasant voice. "Evening, Sheriff. Didn't expect to find you all the way out here." "I'm thorough," Colt said. Voss's eyes moved to Silla standing in the doorway behind him. "Miss Vane, we've been hoping to speak with you about your property. We're prepared to make a generous—" "No," Silla said. Voss smiled. She could hear it even in the dark. "You might want to think on it a night or two." "I've thought on it," she said. "The answer is no. It was no before you rode up, and it'll be no when you ride back. This is my uncle's land, and it is now my land, and there is no number you can put on a piece of paper that changes that." There was a silence. Colt had not moved. He stood between her and the fence line with his hands loose at his sides, and the particular quality of his stillness was its own language, a language that men like Voss had learned to read early and read carefully. "We'll be in touch," Voss said pleasantly. They rode back into the dark. Silla released a breath she hadn't catalogued she was holding. The adrenaline moved through her in a slow, retreating wave, leaving her hands slightly unsteady and her chest full of something she had no immediate name for. Colt turned from the fence line and looked at her standing in the doorway with the rifle still in her hands, and something moved across his face, frustration, relief, something deeper than both that he shut down before it fully arrived. "You should have stayed inside," he said. "You needed someone at your back," she replied. "I needed you safe." The words landed differently than an argument. They both felt it. "You warned me not to fall in love with you," Silla said quietly. The night air sat perfectly still between them. "You never warned yourself about me." Colt said nothing. He looked at her for one long, unguarded moment, long enough that she saw something real behind those careful dark eyes, and then he put his hat on and walked to his horse. She stood at the fence long after the sound of hooves had faded, the desert enormous and quiet around her, the stars extravagant overhead. She had already broken every promise she had made to herself. She had known it for days. She simply hadn't said it out loud until now. He rode out before dawn. Silla knew because she didn't sleep. She lay in the dark listening to the desert's particular nighttime silence, the crickets, the distant coyotes, the occasional shift of wind against the shutters, and somewhere inside all of that quiet, She heard the sound of a single horse moving up the trail toward her property and then stopping outside her fence. She was at the window before she was fully awake. Colt sat on his horse in the gray pre-dawn light, not moving, looking at the house. He couldn't have known she was watching. And yet he sat there for a long moment in the way that people sometimes do when they are saying something they haven't found the words for yet. Then he dismounted, opened the fence gate, walked up to the porch and knocked twice. She opened the door. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had spent 6 weeks giving very little away and were now, in the thin, early light, giving considerably more than he probably intended. He had his posse assembled at the edge of town, he told her. They were riding to the Duskriders' camp at the canyon ridge. The territorial marshal had confirmed their location and authorized the operation. It would be handled cleanly and carefully, and by afternoon it would be finished. "I know," she said. A pause. The sky behind him was turning the particular blue that happens just before the sun commits to rising. "I wanted to make sure you were." "Colt," she said quietly. He stopped. "Come back," she said, just that. 2 words with the entire weight of the last 6 weeks behind them. He looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to hold everything neither of them had said. Then he touched the brim of his hat, turned, walked back to his horse and rode toward the dissolving dark. Silla stood on the porch until he disappeared. Then she went inside, built a fire in the stove. It cooperated immediately, as it had learned to do, and waited. The posse returned to Redstone Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon. Silla heard the distant sound of horses and the town's reaction before she saw anything, a rising noise from the direction of Main Street that carried even out to the ranch, the particular sound of a community exhaling. She had already saddled her horse by the time Mrs. Hattie's boy came riding out with the news. Harlan Voss was in custody. 3 of his men were arrested alongside him. The remainder had scattered into the territory, and nobody from the posse had suffered anything worse than a graze and a great deal of dust. She rode into town. Main Street had arranged itself into something resembling a celebration, people spilling out of doorways, children running alongside the returning riders, the blacksmith pounding someone's back with enormous congratulatory force. The territorial deputy was already processing the prisoners. The saloon had proactively opened its doors in a spirit of civic optimism. Silla pulled her horse to a stop at the edge of the crowd and looked. She found him immediately, the way you find the thing you've been looking for even in a crowd, not by searching but by already knowing where to look. He was dismounting near the sheriff's office, speaking with the territorial deputy, hat pushed back on his head, a long streak of trail dust across his jaw. He was whole. She counted this fact carefully and then again. He spoke with the deputy, shook hands with 2 members of the posse, accepted a brief embrace from the blacksmith with the stoic expression of a man enduring rather than enjoying physical celebration. And then his eyes moved across the crowd with the same quiet deliberateness she had watched for 6 weeks, and they found her at the edge of it. He went still. Silla did not run to him. She had considered it and decided against it, not out of pride exactly, but because some moments deserved to be walked toward. She waited. Her horse shifted beneath her. Mrs. Hattie, visible in her peripheral vision near the bakehouse door, pressed both hands to her mouth. Colt said something brief to the deputy. Then he walked. The crowd parted without being asked, the way crowds sometimes do when they understand they are peripheral to something more important. He crossed the street steadily, unhurried as always, and stopped beside her horse. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. "You came into town," he said. "You came back," she replied. He reached up and took her hand, not to help her dismount, just to hold it, which was entirely unlike him and exactly right. She climbed down and stood in front of him in the middle of Redstone Creek's Main Street with the whole town pretending not to watch and doing it very poorly. "I owe you something honest," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said, "but I'll take it." The corner of his mouth moved. "I warned you not to fall in love with me because it was the only way I knew to protect myself. I hadn't planned on you being—" He paused, and Colt Madigan was not a man who paused. "You." Silla looked at him steadily. "I never sent the letter back to Boston." I know, he said. He had noticed. Of course he had noticed. Why? Because someone once told me not to fall in love with him, she said, and I decided it was the worst advice I had ever been given. He laughed, started quietly and became real, a full, unguarded sound that moved across the street and reached every person standing in it. Mrs. Hattie made a noise that was not technically weeping but was close enough to be the same thing. The blacksmith grinned enormously. Redstone Creek had not heard Colt Madigan laugh like that in 3 years. Everyone present understood this. Nobody said it aloud. Some things are better witnessed than announced. Are you staying? He asked. She considered making him wait for it. She decided she had made them both wait long enough. The ranch needs work, she said, and I am not a quitter. He reached up and removed his hat, that gesture she had catalogued from the very first day, the one he reserved for conversations that deserved the full weight of his attention. He placed it carefully on her head. It sat slightly too large and perfectly right. The crowd, abandoning all pretense, cheered. Autumn came to Redstone Creek the way it does in the Arizona Territory, not with the dramatic foliage of Boston, but with a cooling of the light and a particular smell in the evening air, and the sense that the land was settling into itself contentedly. Silla's ranch was thriving. The barn roof held. The stove required no negotiation whatsoever. The fence line was straight and solid, and she had built the last section herself. She had become, quietly and without particular announcement, part of the town's heartbeat. She read to children at the schoolhouse on Thursday afternoons. She sat on the town council's water rights committee, where her Boston solicitor's vocabulary proved extraordinarily useful. Mrs. Hattie had taught her to make proper corn bread and considered this one of her finest achievements. Every evening, at the hour when the desert light turned copper and long, Colt Madigan rode up the east trail to her ranch. He came without fanfare and without requiring invitation, because invitation had long since become unnecessary. He tied his horse at the fence, walked up the porch steps, and sat in the chair beside hers as the sky moved through its colors. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Both kinds of evenings were equally full. One evening, watching the last of the sun drop behind the red bluffs, Silla thought of that first Tuesday, the dust and the standoff and the tilted hat and the man who had warned her with such careful, self-protective seriousness about the precise thing that had already inevitably begun. She smiled at the memory. Don't fall in love with me, he had warned. And they had both always known it was already too late.